Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin, Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, we're so glad to welcome Dr. Dan Bloomfield, the Chief Medical Officer of Anthos Therapeutics. Today's episode, we're going to dive into three key themes: career development, balancing breadth and depth of opportunities along the way, building an organization, a biotech organization, really with the end in mind and your end goals of what you're trying to scale toward, and what it takes to really scale an organization in terms of timeline, managing investors, working closely with your board, and all of the hiccups that might occur along the way. So, Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. We're really glad to have you.
And my pleasure. Thanks, Kim.
To start us off, can you tell us a little bit about your background, Dan, and really how you got to this current role?
Sure. So I'm a cardiologist. My career started as an academic at Columbia University, where I had grants for about 10 years, and then moved to Merck in 2003 and spent 14 years at Merck in a variety of different roles, from discovery to development, chairing governance committees, working with the CEO. Very broad career. And then I moved to biotech in 2017 and was the founding CEO of a company called Cardurian, where I stayed for 2 years, and then moved to Anthos in 2019, where I've been there since 2019 as the Chief Medical Officer.
Excellent. And taking that, even those career leaps, so starting in big pharma, moving into biotech, and really starting on your own, and then choosing to come back and really be a CMO, those decisions along the way are very unique. And we haven't met many people that have kind of chosen to take these different kinds of roles along the way. Can you tell us a little bit about your decision-making process that led you to each one of the career steps you took, and really bring you to Anthos?
Sure. I mean, it starts at my time at Merck. I'd done clinical trials as an academic, so I had a sense for what industry-related trials are, having been an investigator, which is a very useful experience. But at Merck, I started in clinical pharmacology in the phase 1 group, where you see all kinds of things. Most common compounds don't make it through clin pharm, but you see the spectrum of different compounds and different development plans. And after 3.5 years of doing that, I moved to late-stage development. I followed a molecule that was in clin pharm that I took forward into late-stage development. And I was there for about 4 years. So that's kind of a logical transition from early-stage development to late-stage development. I then became the vice president of translational medicine, where we were kind of connecting discovery to clinical, and did that for about 1.5 years. When the job role was taken away, I chaired a governance committee at that point for 2 years, which is a really helpful experience, because you see all the compounds coming forward. You have to make decisions about the portfolio, guide teams for what you need to know, how to help them present. And I also at the same time ran a project management and a group of project leaders. And then out of the blue, I got a call from the CEO, Ken Frazier, and was asked to interview for a position as his chief of staff. And that was a phenomenal experience. As he said to me when I first started, he said, only you and I have nothing to gain outside of our relationship. Everyone else comes to me with some agenda, something that they want to get accomplished. You and I see things across the board. And it was the first time that I saw the whole company. You're very focused on R&D. You're in R&D. You don't realize what's happening in supply chain or manufacturing or legal or finance, accounting, commercial. So I got exposed to all those things. And that was a really helpful experience, because it put the pieces together. I suddenly realized the interdependencies on these different aspects of the company. Even though in development, you may not be thinking about those things because they're pretty far off, the big picture really does help. And I spent time talking to people about that learning experience and what I learned from that. I then moved to late stage development, back again as the therapeutic area head, was given cardiology and diabetes. And I ran China, which is a chance for me to be thinking about things outside the US. All those experiences were broad. I mean, they were one to the next. There was not a single theme, except most of my time was in the R&D world and clinical. I did lead discovery for a period of time. So that was something that was an area where I knew nothing about. I was asked to do that in a sense to fill a hole in my development. And so I think that was really important to me. After 14 years in pharma, I felt ready to make a change and wanted to move to a smaller a smaller biotech environment. I wasn't sure when that would happen, but once you realize that you want that to happen, it's just waiting for the opportunity. And a friend of mine came by and said he's starting a company. I work with him at Merck. We kind of at the time joked about having a company together one day, and he found assets and found funding and asked me to come on board as the first CEO. And so that was my first step away from pharma, and a really important learning, because all of a sudden the army of people around me wasn't there. It started off with myself, the founder, and then the rest of it was figure out how to do things on your own with other people without being able to go to departments and things. I think about when you're running a team in pharma, you have commercial, you have biology, you have clinical research, you have clin farm, supply chain. They're all sitting around the table with you. And now I sit at the table and there's no one there. So how do I marshal the input I need to help move things along? How do I get the resources externally? I didn't have a lab. I didn't have resources. So I learned a lot about that. I also learned that the CEO wasn't the right position for me. And I learned that a little bit the hard way. It was enticing to want to get to that stage, but my sweet spot is in development. And so at the end of my time at Kushner, I shifted over to Chief Medical Officer, where I was much more comfortable. And then I couldn't resist going to Anthos, which just had a spectacular program that I could not follow through on.
Dan, what do you think your experience? Obviously, you had such an incredible experience at Merck, being able to kind of touch multiple different functions within your tenure there, at a leadership role as well, which is not necessarily an opportunity that everybody gets, right? Usually, you go into one function and you're there for your entire career, or maybe you make a couple of moves, but that's about it. That's the limitation of it. How do you think that learning, what was the one or two things that you think it was major kind of opening your eyes to looking at the bigger picture and across the enterprise that you took with you as a CEO and now as a CMO of Anthos? What are those couple of things that comes to your mind that we can all learn from?
Yeah, well, it first hit me, I think, when I was working for Ken, and he talked about for me to focus on the interdependencies between the different divisions. And I had no idea what that meant at first. And as I got to understand the company writ large, I realized it wasn't just medical affairs, commercial, and clinical, which was the first thing that came to mind. How does the supply chain and manufacturing fit in? All these different pieces, how do they fit together? That gave me the sense for what the entire enterprise requires. There was a colleague of mine who started in clinical development, spent his entire career there. In fact, he just retired. So 25 years in late stage development. And he was the expert in doing late stage development. And at one point he reported to me, and he was one who ran the review of the documents because he knew much more about this than I did. But his career was very vertical. And he was able to gain experience through interactions about the pieces that may connect to him, but never really lived in that space. And that's very limiting. If you don't know the other pieces that are connected to you, then you don't really understand how those things impact you and how you impact them. And so he was successful because he did it for many, many years. When I mentor people, though, I tell them one of your goals should be to build a network and either learn what's happening outside of your function or actually take assignments that are outside your function. And I used to ask my team when I was leading a team, what do you want to do in 5 years? 10 years. And usually they scratch their head. I said, what don't you want to do? And eventually you can get a sense for what the world is that they might be thinking about. And then I would ask them, well, what skill sets do you think you need to have to get to where you are in 5 years? And what's the best way to get those skill sets? It doesn't have to be linear. If you want to learn how to manage people, if you have an opportunity, then take that. I ran project management with 300 people, for a year. That was really helpful to me. And then later on I had China. But at the same time, I needed to learn discovery. How do you get from this molecule and discovery into clinical development? So think about the skill sets you need and then try to be mindful of the opportunities that come up. They won't all come up, but you can gain a lot by finding people in those areas and learn from them. I say to them, if you go to someone and ask them, what do you do? They love talking about what they do. That's what they do all the time. They love that. It's really fun for them. So it's not a burden. The one role I was able to play as a leader was I facilitated those interactions. Someone who's a director doesn't know people in all these different functions and wouldn't know who to turn to. So as I gained my network, I was able to say, let me introduce you to so-and-so or so-and-so. And they'll either talk with you or they'll find someone that is in their group that could talk to you. And as a leader, that's part of what I thought is part of my mentoring, was to expose people to the network and let them gain that. Because you never know if you're really happy where you are, but until you go someplace else, you don't realize, wow, this is what I really want to do. Or I never want to do that, but now I understand it, right? And so that's, I think, what people should think about in their career, is thinking about the skill sets they have to gain to get where they want to go.
I really appreciate all of those points, Dan, and especially that last one on helping to connect people really helps to build other people's career, but it also helps you because you're helping to make the bridges and understanding how these people are going to work together. So you're proactively thinking about the interdependencies that you refer to, and then also building the bridges so that these pieces can work more collaboratively. One thing that really stands out to me in your background and in your advice for others is the idea that you should step outside your comfort zone, either lead or participate in projects in areas that you don't have experience. How do you get in a position, or how do you effectively lead a team of people that have a skill that is so different from your own background? How have you adapted to those roles, either when you're overseeing project management or discovery? What did you do so that you could get up to speed fast enough to be an effective leader when you're coming from a very, very different place?
Sure. It's a good question. And actually, as you rise up in the organization, you think you know what people do and those who are above you. You don't really know till you get there. And that's especially important as you rise up to the level of vice president or senior vice president, where you're in a very different world than you were before. So let me give you two examples. So I was given the opportunity to run project management at the same time as I chaired the governance committee for compounds going into the clinic. I've never led a group of people that were 200. I successfully had groups of 10, 20. But when you get to a group of 200, you won't know all their names. They're people multiple layers down. And I thought, well, I'm a good leader. I can do that. And I was blindsided because I was giving a kind of town hall at one point, and I was reflecting on things without realizing how they would be heard by others. So I might say something about, yeah, I'm thinking about this, or we might want to go this way. And then people a couple levels down would say, okay, I'm doing that. Whereas I was starting a conversation, they're taking it as a direction. Or they may hear something I say as being critical, but it really wasn't meant to be critical. So, and then there were little things like my mannerisms, my body language. I just never thought about that in the way that I learned the hard way in project management. The other thing was, what does a doctor know about project management? I mean, that's very clear to anybody in the group. Here's guys, doctor, and these guys have been project managers for their careers, some new, some experienced. So what do I know about that? And I was very clear up front, I don't know about that. So I did two things. One is I went to boot camp. Boot camp is an experience where new project managers go for a week. And they're in boot camp. They're working all day in the evenings doing projects, putting together proposals. I was with very junior people who were with me. And except for three of them who were in my company, other companies, no one knew that I was running project management. But I learned a lot, and it gave me some credibility because I knew what happened at the ground floor. Just like when I came into clinical development, I'd been an investigator. I knew what it meant to be an investigator. So when you write protocols that you're going to give to investigators, it's important to understand that. So that was one experience that I think was important. The second was same type of thing. I went to lead discovery in cardiology, cardiovascular and disease, and I found when I got there that and they knew I was a clinical cardiologist. I had no bench credentials. I didn't have a PhD. I hadn't worked at the bench. I didn't understand a lot of the intricacies of things that are just common knowledge people are fluent in when they're postdocs, let alone being senior scientists. And so I was questioning what I could, what would I be able to add to that? And as I was preparing for the job, I realized that my job was not to be the expert in assays, was not to be an expert in high throughput screening or in vivo modeling. My goal was to set the strategy and to hear people's presentations and ideas and be able to put them together into a place that made sense in our division with the goals that we had set. And there are many ideas that came to me that were great ideas, but off target. And most of those you put away. Some of those say, well, that's such a good idea, we're going to take it on. But the key thing was, when I started that job, I sat down with my leadership team, all subject matter experts in the different aspects of discovery, right? Chemistry, biology, assays, all those groups. And I said flat out, I said, listen, I don't really know anything about what you guys do. I know what you guys deliver to me in the clinic. And I know what we're trying to do in our franchise, about how we're trying to get from A to B, or where we want to be over the next 5 to 10 years. And so I'll be able to guide that, but I won't be able to tell you how to run an assay or to tell you which reagents to get or which companies to buy things from. That's on you. And if you come to me, I'm going to say, I don't know anything more than you do. You have to do that. And so they then had the perspective of how they were going to use me. They weren't going to come to me to say, should we use this reagent or that reagent? Should I use this model or that model? They came to me with, here's the problem we're trying to solve. Here's the data we're going to collect. Is that the kind of data that help you think that we can move this program along? And so when you frame things in that way to them, they're essentially the leaders of their group. And I'm helped to guide them with strategy. If you think about it, you're a CEO of a Fortune 100 country, Ken Frazier. What does he know about discovery? What does he know about manufacturing, right? You get to that level, you can't have subject matter expertise in any of those things. And in fact, the subject matter expertise you have, he was a lawyer, you have to let go of. Someone else is running the legal department. So any senior role, think about it in politics as you rise up to be the president. What does the president know about all these different things? You have to rely and set yourself up in a place you're surrounded by people who know their work, who you gain trust in, and who know how to help you. And that's really important. So I think that's something that I took back from that. In other cases, I was leading groups where I had subject matter expertise, and I was often having to be careful about when I made a comment. I found myself finding people thought that was a decision. We're talking about different study designs. Oh, this is interesting, and that's interesting, and we talk about one. And then I find out, well, here it is. And I said, what is that? Well, isn't that the design you wanted? And I said, you tell me. We talked about a bunch of things together. I didn't realize that when I talk, it's a decision. And actually, I learned a really interesting tool that a coach gave me once. At the top of the page where I was taking notes, I always wrote the letters WAIT, wait. And what it said was, why am I talking? And it taught me to realize that in some roles, your job is to listen. And you have 2 ears and 1 mouth. You need to listen a lot and be very mindful of what you say. There are a lot of things you could say that probably aren't advancing the conversation. You have ideas. That's a really important skill to gain, because otherwise you don't know all the information you need to know, but you're saying things that are taking them in the direction that could be the wrong direction.
So Dan, maybe following up on what you're saying, one with regards to the specialized skills and the right talent. One question is, do you see a challenge for a smaller biotech or startups to attract the right talent versus maybe a mid-size or a big pharma? That's the first question. And the follow-up is, in the smaller biotech startups, do you find it challenging to get the right specialized skills, and how do you overcome that?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ramin. I think one of the things you learn is that you need lots of different skills to do drug development. You can never have them all. In big companies, they're in your company. You turn to them, they provide resources. When you're in a small company or a biotech, you can't possibly have what you need. So part of the challenge is to figure out what you need at what time and how much do you need of them. In certain situations, you need someone to guide you, right? You don't need a full-time director. You need a part-time expert consultant to set the direction for where you should be heading in that specific area, or to provide feedback to you about your thoughts about where you're going someplace. And other times, you have the strategy. You need people to work to get the work done. And so you realize in a biotech environment where you have a very fixed budget, it's really clear in a way it's not clear in pharma, how you want to build the team you want to build. And headcount's really complicated, because if you build quickly, you have a lot of resources that you're not going to use. And so there's a difference between who you bring in as full-time headcount versus who you bring in as consultants or contractors. And what I learned, especially in Anthos, is that when I came in, we were in a phase 1 program that we put quickly into phase 2B. We were able to do that with about 8 people, but that's because we had CROs and other people doing some of the work, but there were pieces that we couldn't get done. So we had a part-time regulatory person helping us. We didn't need a full-time regulatory person, but there's a lot of sites coming up around the world. Someone had to do that work. And so we had a group that came and helped us with that piece. We didn't have a manufacturing group, so we had people helping us at manufacturing. And so we started as a group of 8, almost everything outside, but it's a pretty simple stage in the company where you're doing a phase 2B study, not big program. As we get to phase 3, everything changes, right? Now you're doing registration studies that have to live up to the scrutiny of the agencies. And so there's a lot of things you don't know that have to happen. And you realize, I just said it yesterday, I keep learning what I don't know. And I'm very cautious about jumping into a decision without someone saying to me, slow down, you're missing some key things that you have to understand before you make that decision. So I think to get back to your question, I think you have to find people to either help guide you or to provide resources that you need. People who help guide you can be senior folks, they could be part-time, they could be friends who sit down with you and have that experience. But then you have to decide what work do I need to get done right now and how am I going to do that. And I think one of the challenges is when you start hiring people, you're hiring them full-time to do a job maybe is half-time. So they pick up other things they do to help out, but they may not be subject matter experts in those other areas. Their skill sets aren't there, but you take that on for them because they're there. They come, you see in biotech, you become a bottle washer, you do everything, right? Well, that's fine, but you realize, certain areas you need people with that expertise. And so one of the benefits of having a model where you have some of the things outsourced and some of the things that are managed by consultants and contractors, you try to get what you need. I need someone to work about 20% to help me build the initial safety function, just the early parts of that. I don't have the ability to do that. I don't know that. I don't want a full-time person to build safety. We're in phase 2. We don't need that yet. Or data management, for example. You don't need a big data management group, and you don't have the need for a full-time person. So yeah, your ClinOps person can try to help with data management, but even better is get someone part-time who can take you to the next step. And then with that relationship, realize, how do you have to grow? Where do you have to be in 6 months or 12 months? Again, for most people, unless they're really experienced, you don't know what you really need in 6 or 12 months till you've been through it, right? People who haven't done phase 2 trials don't know how important quality is. They don't know SOPs, but why are they important, right? As you learn that, you begin to think about, okay, when do I need to bring that expertise on? And how do I get that? So I think a real strength of ours at Anthos is trying to manage that situation where we didn't have a lot of headcount, and yet we needed lots of different skill sets. And we went out there and found them often through consulting groups and the likes. I'm separating that from CROs. CROs are these big pieces that do all the kind of legwork and logistics of the programs. As a small company, you can't do that work, right? They have hundreds of people who do study startup and contracts and other things. So they're doing specific things, and you rely heavily on them. One of the challenges with them is how do you oversee them? Even providing oversight requires people inside the company to provide that. But I'm talking about other groups. We have a part-time consultant who's doing toxicology. We don't need him full-time. Maybe it's 10% on average over the course of 6 months. When we need him to write a document, he's there. When we see a finding in the clinic, we go back to him and say, well, what did you know in toxicology? You don't want that person full-time. At the flip side, there's always this challenge about growth. And there's a period in development where all of a sudden, because your program has taken a quantum leap in its size and importance, where you don't want to load up those resources ahead of time because they're not doing anything. But when you get there, you're really short. All of a sudden, I realize I need 15 people I don't have. And so that's a challenge. It's how to prepare for that growth. And getting advice about what good looks like, what other companies that are successful look like in that environment was really helpful. And then having folks guide you as to where to get those resources was critical to our success. If I think about where I was last March, a year ago, where I am now, that was a huge amount of growth both part-time and full-time, because I was guided by folks who knew the entire story from beginning to end. And that was what really saved the day. Otherwise, we'd be in a really bad place right now. And you think about when you hire people, the more senior they are, the harder they are to find. And so if you think you need someone to be a head of safety, you got to think about 6 months to bring someone in as head of safety or head of ClinOps, whatever it is. These people, these searches take 3-6 months. So we say, oh, I need someone now. Well, you should have known that 6 months ago, 3 months ago. And then it's that balance for when do you bring them in? When do they have to be on board before the things start to happen? That's a real challenge for small companies.
Yeah. One thing I really appreciate that you just called out, Dan, is a lot of organizations think about what is the skill I need now. And so they rapidly try to hire for today's problem, not recognizing what the problem actually is 5 months. But ultimately, where you really got, which I completely agree with, is you really need to design the company with the end in mind. So if the target is an exit and you have no interest in actually, bringing this asset to market yourselves, there's a very different growth strategy than if you do plan to completely commercialize and build the organization long term. But without that vision, you can't work backwards to design what is the right sustainable path to hire your team, and then how do you appropriately in-source and supplement additional resources that may or may not get you there.
Yeah, so three thoughts came to mind as you were speaking, Kim. One is, if you have really experienced people who've taken things to the finish line, they know. I hired someone to my group, a physician, and I wanted to make sure they had phase 3 experience and they'd done actual filings. And so I asked them questions about filings, and then I said, well, what questions do you have for me? And he said, well, how good is your data management and statistical group? I realized that is exactly the right question. He knows where we're going to be as we get closer to filing. So I hired him, and he's been great as part of that. Another thing is, if you're in a big company, those resources are there. They're just on other projects. So you get that feedback. And big doesn't have to be pharma. It could be a company of 300 or 200, but you have multiple projects going on. So the person who's head of safety says, okay, this project needs that. And so that's something that makes it easier. One of the challenges in biotech is your investors are thinking about an exit. They don't want to spend past the exit. And so they're constantly giving you budgets and constraining your resources to get to whatever point they think will be the exit. And the challenge is, if you get to that point and you don't exit, now you're faced with, well, the company has to go further. And are you prepared for that? That's a scary place to be when you realize that. But of course, the board's pushing you in that direction. They want to invest as little as they can to get the biggest return to get to a certain point in time. And so that's something to be aware of, especially if you're in a CMO position or other leadership positions where you're constantly having to tell them, here's where things are going, here are the resources I need. And then they're going to be asking you, well, how much is it going to cost? How many do you need? Can you get by with other people? That's your job to push them. You have to help them make the right decision.
You also have to educate them through the process as well. Right? They're not going to know all of these things. You're there to kind of educate them along the way as well. And that becomes also critical and really important.
So one comment about that. I used to teach when I was teaching teams or mentoring teams in Merck. I would say to them, your job is to help the management team or the decision makers. Your job is to help them make the right decision. They don't know what the decision is. You have to help them make it.
It's on you.
And so you have to prepare them to have the story from A to B so they come up with the right answer in C. And that's a different mindset than often people kind of say, well, I want to give them what they want, right? So I'm going to, may not be what you want, may not be what you think is the best, but they're thinking about it the wrong way. I said, think of them as idiots. Think of them as not knowing anything about what you're doing. Tell them what they have to do to be successful.
Can you think of a time that you had to deliver not such a positive message to the investors and the board members, and what was your thinking process? How did you go by putting your communication together and go in front of the investors or with the board members to educate them, and what was the outcome of it? Think of a situation that was maybe more challenging and difficult to manage.
Yeah. So that question comes up all the time. I mean, in a leadership position, every time you go to the board, there's things that you have to tell that aren't good news. You never go in saying everything's rosy. There's always things, right? So I think there's a couple things to balance. One is you need to be transparent. The last thing you want to do is tell them they're okay to hit this timeline, only to find out at the next board meeting you're behind. And so you tell them then, well, I think I can catch up. So you keep the timeline where it is. And at some point you realize you're never going to get there. And so all of a sudden you've had 2 or 3 board meetings and they're thinking you're going to have it done, let's say, at the first of the year. And you realize it's going to be another 6 months after that. That's a really bad place to be. So then you have to think about how do you describe it to them in a way that says, here's where you are. Here's where I want to be. Here are the risks that are involved. So you're aware of the risks and how I'm going to approach those risks. And the goal would be to bring them into that decision so they understand what is you're facing, what's on your radar screen. They understand the different pieces. So when you get there, when you say, yeah, we weren't able to get these sites activated, well, you told them we're having challenges against the activated. It's not a surprise to them. The more they understand about the different risks they're facing, the better it is for you because they understand them. On the flip side, there are times when you don't know. So you set a timeline. Let's say you set a timeline for January of 25. And at first you think you can hit it. Then you get a little more information. You're behind in site activation, enrollment's slow, but you plan to catch up. So at what point do you tell them there's a yellow flag, right? And so you can present data as we're on our curve. We're just on the flat course. It's going to take off like this. All of a sudden it goes a little bit further. Now you think, well, it's supposed to go like this. Now it's still here. When do you communicate that? Because you don't want them being part of the sausage making. You don't want them getting there and involving themselves in all the things that are going on. So there's a balance between what you know and what you're ready to share and what's important for them to hear. There are things you know that they don't need to know yet. They don't need to make this. It's not actionable for them to make a decision, and it's unlikely to be a big problem in the short term. Then don't waste their time with it. They're not going to know what to do with that information. So that's the balance. And people have different styles. Some CEOs are very transparent. The board respects that. They get beat up. Yeah, this is bad over and over again. But the board trusts that you're giving them the truth. Others try to, sweet talk them. We're here. We're going to make it to here. Don't worry. We have these things happening. And as you get into that pattern, you keep pushing the can down the road and you suddenly can't catch up. And so that's a really important skill. As a CMO, you have to do that with your CEO. In fact, the whole team has to agree on this because it affects all the different functions. If I'm pushing for a timeline here, manufacturing is getting ready for having drug there. If we're not ready, then there's drug going to expire. It's a waste of money. Flip side, if you end up getting there early, they're not ready. So it really is a team decision. But you and your CEO, with their management style, has to decide what to tell the board. And it is the CEO's job to tell the board. My view was I let the CEO drive how he wanted to communicate, but I was always very clear with him about what I thought, what the risks were. And I told him, if I'm asked this question, here's what I have to say. If he wants to suggest that we're going to be okay through here, I'll say, well, if they ask me that question, I'm going to say, well, there's a lot of risk there.
So we've talked about a lot so far. We've started really about the criticality of being a great connector and how that helps expand people's skill sets in various roles in their career. We talked about humility and leading people with different skill sets. And now we're really spending a lot of time on this really great topic of how to manage your board and making sure that there's no surprises and you're most proactively managing timelines in a growing biotech, and that being so critical to meeting those key milestones. Dan, one last question for you before we end today's conversation. This industry is changing so rapidly, and you've seen different permutations of it at different stages of your career. What's a point of advice you have for somebody just moving into biotech from big pharma or entering from practice for such a dynamic and changing industry? What is the key to being successful as you take on your first leadership role in a biotech?
Yeah. Well, from practice, it's really challenging because they haven't had the experience of being in the industry environment. In practice, you're usually taking on people who are clinical researchers, they're academics. Somebody in private practice might fit into medical affairs, but they're not going to make it into development without starting from the ground. They have to know how to run trials. I think that the real key is to know what you're being hired for. What do they expect of you? Do you have the skill sets to deliver that? And who's going to be looking over what your work? So if you're coming in as the person to lead a program, you really haven't led a lot of programs, but there's no other physician or scientist in the company that is more experienced than you, then you're exposed. You don't have the experience you need. That's okay if you find other people outside the company to mentor you, but that's a difficult place to be. Rather, you come to a company, they want to hire for this position, you lay out flat and clear, here's what I can do. Here's where I'd like to grow, but I don't have experience in that. So they know up front. There's no misunderstanding when something comes up. The person says, why are you getting this done? Well, I told you this is not my area of expertise. If you try to sell yourself as having someone who's done it all, then you're in a bad place. And that also relates to whether you've run one program or multiple programs. I think there's growing up in pharma and even in biotech, there's a big difference when you take one program forward and see it through to when you're managing 5 programs with people who report to you, because you see so much more in 5 people. And then you get further up and you have 20 programs that you see. So all that is learnings that you can't predict. It's not linear. You can't read a book and take a course and then go to course 201, course 301, course 401. It doesn't work that way. You learn in ways that are based on what things are happening and what the issues are. The more experience you have, the more you've seen those issues. So I think that's what I would suggest. Make sure that the expectations for your career are ones that you can deliver. If they're a stretch for you, identifying that up front, look for people to support you either in the company or others. There may be a board member who's got that experience who can mentor you if that needs to be the case. But when you get to more senior roles, it's important because you don't know everything. You can't possibly know everything. And so you really have to think about not just what you know that you don't know, but also what you don't know, you don't know. And that's important to kind of keep your eyes and ears open for. So that's, I think, what I would say is it's a learning process. If you're in pharma, you gain skills in a fairly linear way. You work in one department, you get good at it. Different department, get good at it. When you're in biotech, you're the departments. There's not 5 departments. So you have to learn multiple things on the fly. And I find myself in a position as a biotech leader with, do I hire someone from another biotech company who's really been doing a lot of different things, has breadth, but hasn't seen a whole lot, versus someone in pharma who's seen a whole bunch of programs in that function. But the problem with pharma is they're in the pharma mindset. They make decisions based on a risk-averse, kind of mindset. And so the biotech person's innovative, creative, wanting to take risks. The pharma person's like, well, we have to do all these things, which all cost money because of this risk. So that's a trade-off. And I think it's an important one when you think about hiring is what are the skills you need? You need an expert in the field that's going to deliver that expertise, or do you want an innovative thinker who's seen some things, has a lot of experience, but is going to push the envelope?
Absolutely. Dan, that's incredible advice. I really appreciate kind of thinking about the breadth of opportunities, leaning into them and finding your ability to be successful in that career. And you've done amazing things. We've really enjoyed partnering with you. And thank you so much for joining us on today's show.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Kim. Thanks, Ramin.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.